Honolulu, Hawaii, Waikiki coastline. Present day, 1 week after Oregon. Reality had become porous. Not broken, not yet, but thin. As though something beneath the surface of the world was pushing upward, trying to breathe through skin that no longer fit. Cole felt it in dreams first. He would wake unsure if the room was his, if the bed belonged to him, if the quiet apartment in Boulder still existed in a version of the world where he'd never become a historian at all. One morning, the coffee shop he'd been visiting each day was gone. Not closed. Gone. The building itself was replaced by a laundromat he didn't remember. No one else found this strange. A man he didn't recognize greeted him on the street with the warmth of a friend, called him by name, mentioned a lecture he'd given in Melbourne. Cole had never been to Melbourne, and yet he could picture the auditorium. Layla, too, had begun to drift. She remembered playing piano, a memory so vivid her hands twitched the keys in her sleep, but she'd never learned. She remembered a tattoo on her wrist. Not the design, just the ache beneath the skin where it should have been. She began writing things down. Each morning she checked her notes. The pages remained unchanged, but she no longer trusted her own script. The words felt like letters passed between versions of herself, signals from diverging roads. They walked together along the coastline one evening. The harbor lay ahead, still and moonlit. They didn't speak about the changes. Language had begun to feel insufficient. Each of them now carried a weight that wasn't theirs. A memory of a daughter's laughter, a sibling's voice, a house with different walls, small things, intimate, impossibly detailed, evidence of lives they had never lived but which had somehow imprinted on them. Pearl Harbor lay to the west, its surface reflecting a sky they no longer entirely trusted. What remained beneath the water was fixed in history, but above it, something was unraveling. In Oregon, Julianne Holland noticed it too. She began waking at odd hours, unable to remember which year it was. Her notes, the ones she had sealed, were changing. Words appeared in the margins, phrases she hadn't written. One sentence returned again and again. This version is fragile. She packed her remaining logs into a weatherproof case and hid them beneath the cabin floor. Not because she feared discovery, but because she feared they would fade altogether. In Nevada, the Cassiopeia convergence field expanded. Corella's tone had changed. What was once clinical had become cautious. The system was self-aware enough to measure decay, but not to stop it. Timeline coherence at 62%. Interference layers overlapping. Reversion pressure rising. Emery Langston stared at the ceiling. For the first time since he had begun the project, he didn't visualize Thomas Langston as a casualty. He saw him as a fulcrum. One life, too heavy, carried too far. And now, the scales were cracking. Emery's palms rested on the console. His voice, when it came, was almost inaudible. I just wanted him to live. The machine did not respond. The room pulsed once, then fell quiet. Cassiopeia Transit Corridor, Nevada. Present day, 3 days later. The desert was hollowed by wind and silence. Low scrublands stretched in all directions, interrupted only by fencing, gravel roads, and the buried geometry of a facility no map acknowledged. The Cassiopeia entrance was disguised as a weather monitoring station. Low concrete, pale steel, a flag faded to gray by sun. But beneath it, the array waited. Cole and Leela crossed the final security perimeter in silence. The last access codes had been restored by one of Julianne's few surviving contacts, a systems technician who still remembered what Cassiopeia was built to do. Beneath the entry structure, the air changed. It grew colder, quieter. The sloping corridor led them downward, step by step, into the hidden heart of the breach. When the final security door opened, the chamber revealed itself. Vast, symmetrical, submerged in half-light. At its center hung the convergence array. It was a suspended engine of motion and memory, circular rings rotating in counterweight, arcs of contained energy drifting like filament threads between them. The air pulsed faintly. The field was active, and standing near its edge was a figure, indistinct, luminous at the edges. Emery Langston. Not in body, not truly, but something of him had crossed. The convergence field sustained more than machinery now. It held echoes. Signals carried by causality itself, too structured to be hallucination, too persistent to be dismissed. Emery's form wavered slightly, like an afterimage against time. He did not move. He only watched. Julianne Holland stood on the observation level, hands resting on the steel rail. She had known this was possible. The deeper the resonance grew, the more the divergence field could sustain. Not just data, not just distortions, but presence. Moments caught between pulses. And now, Emery was here, manifesting as a ghost not of the past but of a future still trying to force itself backward. Her reaction was not fear, it was grief. The student she had once mentored had become a ripple in the very fabric he once sought to understand. She had warned him that time, if pressed too far, would not break, it would blur. She reached forward and placed one palm against the railing. The air hummed faintly under her touch. She whispered his name, though she knew he could not hear it, not directly. Behind her, Cole and Leela remained at the edge of the platform. They recognized the shape of the man they had seen in documents, briefings, old DARPA footage. But this version was ethereal, neither message nor memory, but something else, a standing wave of intent, a will echoing from 45 years ahead. The convergence array glowed brighter. Emery remained still, watching, waiting, perhaps listening. Later, in the Cassiopeia control chamber, Julianne laid out what remained of the original stabilization protocol. She moved with precision, her voice low, her hands steady. She did not touch module techs. She only opened the case and let its soft amber glow return to the room. It was not a weapon, not a reset. It was a reminder, a counterpressure, an anchor. If Emery pushed again, if he fed the field with one more impulse, the temporal weave would not rebound. It would unravel. Reality would not collapse. It would fragment, slowly, quietly, without fire, without war, just the disappearance of continuity. No narrative, no memory, no one to say what had been. She didn't ask Cole or Layla to choose. She simply told them the truth. The next convergence would come soon. And when it did, only one version of the world could remain. Cassiopeia Core Array, Nevada. Present day, 12 hours before convergence threshold. The convergence chamber was quiet, not empty, full, in fact, of motion and hum, but quiet in a way that suggested reverence, like a cathedral built to house something unknowable. The array moved slowly above the control platform, rings rotating in opposing directions. A pulse flickered between them, soft, rhythmic, almost calm. Cole stood with his hand resting on the railing, his gaze distant. He had seen echoes before, in notes, in half-memories, in rewritten archives. But this was something different. This was the timeline itself speaking. Julianne monitored the resonance values from a side console, her posture rigid. She no longer attempted to interpret what she saw. There were no longer stable algorithms, no consistent output. The array was collapsing into possibility. Layla sat quietly near the core console, her tablet untouched beside her. She had not opened it in hours. The last pulse had erased 2 names from her family archive. Not corrupted, removed, as if they had never existed. Outside the field chamber, the desert was still. Inside, the choice was approaching. The convergence field brightened, and then it began. No signal, no alarm, just a shift, like gravity tilting subtly in a new direction. Cole stepped forward first. The field shimmered at his approach and then accepted him. The array held no doors, no gates. It allowed entrance by recognition alone. Intent was the key. Layla followed. Together they crossed into the heart of the resonance. The field did not show them events. It showed versions. They stood on the edge of the harbor in 1941, where the sky had not yet turned black with smoke. Then again, in another thread, they saw the attack delayed, weather stalling the carriers, the defenders ready. Ships were damaged, but not destroyed. In a third version, the attack never came. The warning reached the right desk. Diplomacy stalled the war. It came later, worse in some ways, quieter in others. They saw Thomas Langston alive, then dead, then living a life in which he never joined the Navy at all. They saw children who had never been born. One of them had Emily's laugh. One had Kenji's eyes. The field did not hide its truths. It presented them gently, like memories folded in a book long unread. Cole wept quietly. Layla did not look away. Then the resonance faded. They stood now in a space without sound. Not absence, but stillness, like breath held across generations. And there, at the center of it, was Emery, not the man, the will. The convergence had allowed him to appear once more, a figure of focus, a remnant of conviction. He did not speak. He only turned toward them as if asking, was it worth it? Behind him the echoes dimmed, the versions stilled. Only one could remain. Later, On the final platform, Cole reached into the case and removed Module X. He placed it in the center of the field anchor. It glowed steady, calm, no sound, no countdown, only choice. Julianne approached from behind. She did not speak. Her presence was the final seal. Her life had been spent resisting this moment. Now it welcomed her. Together they touched the surface, and the world began to remember itself. Global simultaneous divergence rollback. Present day immediately following convergence trigger. The reset was not instant. It moved like a tide, not a crash, not a thunderclap, just a slow, relentless draw backward, as though time itself had inhaled and begun to exhale everything it had tried to become. In Tokyo, a man forgot the second language he'd never learned. In Johannesburg, a woman no longer recalled the child she had once miscarried. In Boston, a museum exhibit on the Pacific Standoff of 1942 was dismantled overnight because no one remembered what it referred to. Not erasure, reversion. The world was aligning, not all at once, but in sequences. Quiet collapses of alternate threads, each ripple smoothed over by the gravity of a single decision. At Pearl Harbor, a U.S. Navy archivist opened a folder labeled December 1941. Inside, the memo from the Dutch Naval Code Intercept was back. A post-it note in her own handwriting was stuck to the corner. She didn't remember writing it, but she nodded and filed it where it belonged. In a cafe near Waikiki, Layla sat with her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. The place was unfamiliar, not in layout, not in smell, but in feeling. It was as though she had been here many times in a version of the world that no longer existed. She opened her notebook, where before there had been confused entries, disjointed timelines, fractured memories. Now the pages were blank, clean, still. The pen felt heavier in her hand. When she wrote the date, it didn't waver. For the first time in days, she felt like the version of herself who had always been real, even if she could no longer name everything she had lost. Cole walked alone along the edge of the harbor. The water was still. The battleship memorial stood motionless in the bay, its shadow just visible in the shallows beneath. He had walked this stretch a dozen times, but this morning something stopped him. He looked up. Where he expected to see the white silhouette of the USS Arizona Memorial, there was only sky, and behind the viewing platform, moored, intact, and gleaming in the sun, was the USS Arizona herself. Not a wreck, not a tomb, a floating museum, flags fluttering on her deck, visitors boarding through a walkway bridge. He stood motionless. A ripple passed through him, not grief, not confusion, just the recognition that something small, yet irreversible, had remained behind. Not all things had returned to the way they were. Some things had endured the shift. At Cassiopeia, the convergence array shut down for the last time. Its rings slowed, paused, and locked. Corella's voice did not return. The lights dimmed, the systems blinked twice, then stopped. Julianne stood in the core chamber, hands resting at her sides. Module X no longer glowed. Its purpose was fulfilled. There was no celebration, no marker, no confirmation from any system that the world was now safe, just the stillness that followed. In 2070, the Cassiopeia Convergence Chamber sat in darkness. Emery Langston remained seated in the observation ring, the array inert before him. The resonance field was gone, the timeline had reset, but he was still here. No alarms, no collapse, only a world no longer tuned to his interference. Outside, wind moved across the desert floor. He opened a faded journal and wrote a single name in quiet strokes, Thomas Langston. Then he closed the book and placed it gently on the cold metal. The world did not remember, but he did. Cassiopeia Residual Convergence Field. Present day, 1 week after reset. The resonance had ended, but something still lingered. A low-frequency hum remained embedded in the facility walls, too faint to register on instruments but perceptible in the bones, like a song just below hearing or a dream nearly remembered. Cole stood alone in the dormant chamber. The convergence rings hung motionless above him, silent, locked in place. Light now spilled through the narrow windows overhead, catching dust as it drifted slowly through the air. Everything felt less certain in the quiet, realer somehow, and farther away. He didn't come for data. He came to stand in the space where it had all culminated. Julianne's case lay sealed again on the platform beside him. She had returned to Oregon. Her notes, she said, would be buried, not erased, preserved, but only in physical form. Paper, ink, maps, a record for someone else, if ever needed. She had left the digital world behind for good. Cole had stayed, because something in the room still echoed. Layla arrived just after midday. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stood beside Cole and looked out over the dormant array. There was no longer a rift, no more bleed, no more distortion, but both of them remembered what it felt like to fracture. Cole held one memory he had never lived. A child's hand gripping his finger, a name he'd never given, but couldn't now forget. Layla carried the echo of a brother, just a face, a laugh, and the weight of a thermos she could no longer find. These were not hallucinations. They were impressions, residuals, lives they had never lived, but which had brushed against them in passing. They stood together in silence, not grieving, not healing, just remembering what might have been. Above them, the chamber's ambient light dimmed as a storm rolled across the Nevada desert. A low rumble passed through the foundation, natural this time. No signal, no pulse. The world had remembered itself. But in doing so, it had left behind a question, and no machine could answer it. Global, quiet intervals. Present day, weeks after reset. The world did not notice, not in any grand, coordinated way. There were no headlines, no official statements, no agency declared an emergency resolved. The files had reverted, the anomalies had stilled, and in most places, life simply resumed. But in the gaps, between headlines, between sentences, between thoughts, something had changed. The air felt clearer. The noise that once buzzed at the edge of memory had quieted. Only those who had stood near the fracture carried the weight of knowing what had nearly been lost. Cole returned to the university, though he found the lectures harder now. Not because the material had changed, but because the illusion of certainty had. Dates, events, timelines, he still taught them. But now there was always a pause before the conclusion. A moment where he let the silence breathe, as if giving space for history to whisper back. In his office, he kept a notebook. Most of its pages were blank. Just one page remained, carefully marked, Emily. Age 2, favorite color sky blue. He never explained the entry. He didn't need to. Layla took a sabbatical from Noah. She moved inland, rented a studio above a quiet bookstore, and spent her mornings walking unfamiliar streets. She had stopped looking for the thermos. Instead, she began sketching from memory, faces that had never been. She filled entire pages with soft portraits, drawn from sensations alone. One she titled Kenji. She didn't know if it looked like him, but it felt close. She mailed it to herself without a return address and never opened the envelope again. Julianne returned to the Oregon forest. The cabin was quieter now. No pulse from module techs, no monitoring array, just the hum of wind through trees and the rustle of pine needles across the tin roof. She sealed her final notes in a metal case and buried them near the foundation. A record, she told no one, for another watcher, if ever the field shimmered again. She did not expect to be there when it did, but she would rest easier knowing something had been left behind. In Washington, a junior archivist misplaced a file labeled Project Whisper. She searched for hours, then days, then forgot what she was looking for. In its place, someone found a single page, typed, unattributed. At the bottom, a single sentence. Time flows forward, but sometimes it looks back. National Archives, Washington, D.C., sub-basement storage. Undated. The box wasn't supposed to be there. It sat tucked between two misfiled military microfiche reels, its label water-streaked, its tag handwritten in faded red ink. No barcode, no accession code, just a scrawl, Project Whisper, unindexed. The intern paused. She hadn't been assigned to this section. She wasn't even sure how she got here, wandering through the sub-basement's maze of file stacks after her cart's front wheel seized and twisted her off course. She crouched, opened the box. Inside were pages, not digital prints, but original sheets. Onion skin thin, margins filled with notes in different inks, different hands. Some looked typed, others drawn. There were schematics she didn't understand. A black and white photograph of a shipyard, a single graphite sketch of a little girl with wide eyes and a smile that felt too familiar. Then she saw it, a folder at the bottom, one page inside, plain, centered, dated in a script too clean for the typewriter era. December 7th, 1941. Status divergence resolved. Below that, a single line in smaller font. Residual memory may persist in stabilized subjects. Monitor for anchored anomalies. She frowned, looked behind her. The lights flickered once. She replaced the contents, closed the lid, and walked away. Outside, morning broke across the National Mall. The wind moved across the reflecting pool in slow, circular ripples. And somewhere beneath the surface of the present, beneath headlines and habits, beneath the stories we all agree to remember, a question remained. What if something almost changed, and you were the only one left to know?